Welcome to the 2021 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candace Black, and I am your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages. This workshop, entitled Understanding Performance Indicators and CanDo Statements, will help participants learn how to identify the key language functions embedded in the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages adopted in 2021, as well as how to write aligned, learner-friendly CanDo statements. Our presenters will explore how to use performance indicators aligned to checkpoint proficiency targets as a tool for providing learner feedback, promoting learner self-evaluation and agency, and as a means to differentiate instruction and assessment. Before we begin, let's review a few housekeeping details. We have over 400 pre-registered attendees today, so we ask that you remain muted and that you reserve the use of chat for questions for the presenters or for when the presenters specifically instruct participants to use this feature. If you accidentally get disconnected, just reconnect or call me and I'll assist you. My cell is on the confirmation email I sent you yesterday. Entered into the chat is the link to the handouts folder. I will enter this again throughout the workshop. In this folder, you'll find the revised standards, the themes and topics, a draft of the proficiency ranges and performance indicators, crosswalks, and more. The PDF of the presentation will be added to this folder at the end of this workshop. Within 24 hours of this event, those who attend will receive either a certificate of attendance or a CTLE certificate. The type of certificate that you will receive was indicated on the confirmation email that you got after you registered. This workshop is being recorded. The video will be uploaded to the World Languages Professional Learning website within about a week of this event. Those who are unable to attend this live event will be able to watch the webinar and will be able to earn CTLE credit by viewing the video and answering 7 out of 10 questions correctly on a post-assessment. Before I introduce our presenters, I'd like to thank the following individuals for their help in assisting with this workshop: Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez, Jian Liu, Louisa Mota, and Eris Thompson. Our workshop presenters today are Bill Heller and Dr. Joanne O'Toole. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Bill and Joanne to begin this workshop.
Good morning, everyone. Today, our workshop is called Understanding Performance Indicators and CanDo Statements. So you'll see these symbols throughout. You all have your microphones on mute. Thank you very much for that. When you see this blue bubble, this will be an indication that we'll be asking you to think about something, to process some information that we've just presented. You won't have to enter anything at the chat box at that point. Just think about what we're asking you to consider. There are points along the way where we will be asking for feedback or questions in the chat box. And when that happens, you'll see this green speech bubble. And when you see the file folder, that indicates that anything that we're talking about, the document that we're referencing at that point, will be found in the handouts folder, that the link of which you saw in the chat box. To give you a plug of upcoming events, on Tuesday, September 28th, we'll be presenting another webinar from 4 to 5 p.m. on understanding the New York State World Language themes and topics. And then we'll have a unique opportunity for you to sign up for small group sessions to apply some of the principles that we'll be covering, either held on October 5th, 6th, or 7th. Each of the presenters will be facilitating one of those small group sessions that will help you apply the information to your own situation about the themes and topics in anticipation of developing curriculum. On Tuesday, October 26th, we'll be having a session on unit planning, the first of 3, unit planning with the revised standards, how to put everything together that we've been talking about since last March into a thematic unit. And then after that, to talk about unit planning, their approaches, 2 national level speakers, very well known. In November, we have Rebecca Bluewolf, the 2020 ACTFL Teacher of the Year, and she'll talk about unit planning with us. And Later on in December, we'll have Lisa Shepard, who's known online as Madame Shepard. She also is a well-known national speaker on the topic of thematic unit planning centered around authentic resources. All of these sessions will give you an opportunity to earn CTLE either by attending in live or in participating in the recorded session. So today's goals are as follows. I can describe the relationship between performance and proficiency. I can identify the target proficiency ranges for each checkpoint. I can identify the contents and organization of the New York State World Language Performance Indicators. 4, I can describe the relationship between standards, language functions, performance indicators, and learning targets. And then finally, I can write CanDo statements driven by language functions and aligned to proficiency targets described in the performance indicators. Oops. To set the foundation for our topic today, we need to quickly review some of the basics that have been covered in detail in previous webinar sessions. In introducing folks to the new New York State Learning Standards for World Language, we throw around a lot of terms that have very highly specific meanings for our field, some of which may be new to you. Performance indicators, context, language functions, checkpoints, can-do statements, standards, proficiency targets. I'd like you to think a moment about these. Take a look at these words again. What's your understanding of these concepts? And how do you think they all fit together? How does one fit with the other? Just take a look at the list and think about it for a minute. You don't have to put anything in the chat. Just think about, how do these fit together? How is one related to the other? So in this presentation, what we hope to be able to do is to help you piece these elements all together in a useful way. So let's start reviewing some basics. First of all, what is proficiency? ACTFL describes proficiency or defines proficiency as a description of what individuals can do and cannot do with language in terms of speaking, writing, listening, and reading in real-world situations in a spontaneous and non-rehearsed context. There are 4 basic elements of proficiency. They are function, or what speakers are able to do with the language; accuracy, which is always defined in terms of how well a speaker is understood and how used the speaker is to dealing with non-native speakers of their language; context, the circumstances or settings in which a person uses the language; and finally, the text type, or the quantity and organization of language produced, whether that's word level, phrase level, sentences, strings of sentences, paragraphs, or more extended discourse. Those are the elements of proficiency. In previous webcasts, we've discussed in detail the levels and sublevels of proficiency as defined by ACTFL in the United States. After studying many years of data and research and the experiences of educators across the country, in consultation with teachers in 10 different working groups across the state of New York, the Content Advisory Panel for World Languages has established these proficiency targets for New York State, beginning first with Checkpoint A students in the fall of 2023. They are identified and grouped by Foreign Service Institute, or FSI, language groups. The first group are referred to as Category 1 and 2 languages. Those are languages that use the Roman alphabet, like our Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, and so forth, and also the Germanic languages, like German. those are considered category 1 and 2 languages. And those checkpoint A, at the end of checkpoint A, you're at novice high. The end of checkpoint B, you're targeting intermediate mid. And at the end of checkpoint C, you're targeting intermediate high. For category 3 and 4 languages, these are languages that do not use Roman script, like Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, and Russian. These languages have a slightly longer time for English speakers to learn, and therefore the proficiency targets have been modified accordingly, again, based on many years of research on how many hours, how much contact time it requires to acquire these languages at the different proficiency levels. So at the end of checkpoint A, the target is novice high, and the end of checkpoint B, intermediate low, and the end of checkpoint C, intermediate mid. In the classical languages have a little bit of a modification. Their interpretive reading standards or targets, proficiency targets, are exactly the same as the category 1 and 2 languages. However, modifications are made for the other modes of communication, the other communication standards, considering that there are no living native speakers of those languages. And in addition, in the classical languages, you'll recall that standard 2 and 3 are switched, so that standard 2 for the classical languages is presentational communication, and standard 3 is interpersonal. So let's review. What is the difference between performance and proficiency? Performance, the type of thing we do in the classroom, involves practicing, making rough drafts, giving students scaffolds as they work and perform, and then slowly taking these scaffolds away or giving them as much scaffolding they need to differentiate our instruction. And performance involves feedback and revision, and going back and trying it again in rehearsal and that sort of thing. It's like having training wheels on your bicycle. Whereas proficiency is what you can do on demand, no rehearsal, no scaffolds, no training wheels. What you can do, if I plop you into a target language speaking country, what can you do with the language that you have in your head and the skills that you've acquired? That's what proficiency is. So we can talk about this quote from ACTFL helps us to understand the target instruction, that how we set these targets slightly above what the students are performing at, so that they're constantly improving in their proficiency. It's kind of like Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, if you will. Take a look at this quote. In an instructional environment, the content and tasks are controlled, resulting in higher expectations of performance compared to how they perform in a non-instructional environment, or in other words, their proficiency. So we're targeting instruction with the scaffolds, with the help, with the rehearsal, always a little above where the students, if we take the scaffolds away, that'll give us a true idea of what their proficiency is. Now Joanne will talk to us about performance indicators.
So now that we've recalled proficiency and the relationship between proficiency and performance, we'll introduce you to the performance indicators. So what constitutes performance indicators? Well, you can see in this graphic that it's our proficiency targets. Remember, these are each of the proficiency targets associated with our 3 checkpoints, and our standards, our New York State World Language Standards. And when those come together, they form what we refer to as proficiency or performance indicators. So we're going to be taking a closer look at those. And in case you're not as familiar as you would like to be, or you missed the webinars from earlier this year, you have the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages, and a document that tells you ways to read and make sense of those standards in your folder. And we always invite you to go back to our archived webinars that are posted on the Office of Bilingual Education World Languages Professional Learning webpage. So the inspiration for creating performance indicators for New York State world language teachers to use are the necessful, actful, can-do statements. Some of you may already be very familiar with these. And what these do is that they marry the national standards, the world readiness standards for learning languages, with the proficiency targets. The necessful, actful, can-do statements have both proficiency benchmarks and performance indicators. We don't have let me start that over. We don't have proficiency benchmarks. We opted to just simply create performance indicators again. We have mode of communication or communication standard, and then we have the proficiency sublevels. So if you already have this familiarity, that should help with your familiarity of the performance indicators. So I love this quote because I think it gives us a way to think about our performance indicators, although it was written with the necessful, actful, can-do statements in mind. Providing students with the can-do statements is like giving them the photo on the cover of the jigsaw puzzle box. The can-do statements provide not only the goal, but also what it looks like when the goal is achieved. One of the things that I was reading in preparation for this workshop was somebody who was writing about their students who talk about either I'm fluent, of course we know that's not the word, proficient is the word we've been using, or I'm not fluent, as if it were a dichotomy. And yet we can see that the puzzle comes together in pieces and over time, just like our students' language proficiency develops in pieces and over time, but always developing a picture. So let's take a moment to dissect our performance indicators. You'll find these in the folder. There is one page or a page and a half of performance indicators for each of the standards. So one for standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so where this first red circle or oval is located, you'll see this one happens to be interpersonal. But in that upper left-hand corner is where you'll see which standard is represented in a particular set of performance indicators. The next thing you'll see are what are referred to as guiding questions. It parses out the ways in which a given standard can be applied and guides our thinking around the application of the performance indicators. Third, you can see that it's organized by checkpoint. So we have checkpoint A, checkpoint B, checkpoint C, and then the ranges within each checkpoint. For example, checkpoint A being novice mid to novice high, checkpoint B intermediate low to intermediate mid, and checkpoint C continuing with intermediate mid and moving to intermediate high. The next thing that we want to have you think about is the fact that if you are teaching, for example, in a traditional 712 program, 9th grade, level 2, because of course checkpoint A would be a 2-year level 1 course, with a proficiency target of an intermediate low, you might work with this document vertically within a given standard and vertically across standards to know what the target is for the performances of students in your given course. However, we invite you to also think about using the performance indicators horizontally. If you were in attendance in our last workshop on proficiency and scaffolding proficiency development, one of the things we talked about, and I'll come back to a little bit later, is the idea of, number one, where are our students? What's our current proficiency target? And where do we want them to go? How do we want to promote their proficiency development? And it's by looking ahead that we can do that kind of planning. So we have put a little red box around one performance indicator that's associated with this interpersonal communication standard, because we're going to use this as an example on the next several slides. So let's take a closer look. So this graphic should look kind of familiar. a few minutes ago, Bill reminded you about the 4 elements of proficiency. Function, accuracy, context, and text type are FACT, F-A-C-T. This slide is the elements of performance. And the first thing you should notice is that accuracy is not an element of performance as it's represented in the performance indicators. So the 3 elements that you will find in each and every performance indicator is the language function, what speakers are able to do with the language, the context, circumstances or setting in which a person uses the language, and the text type, the quantity and organization of the language produced. We're going to take a closer look at these ideas. So first, the function. Look at our performance indicator. Again, this was interpersonal communication at the intermediate low level. Exchange information in conversations on familiar topics, creating simple sentences and asking appropriate follow-up questions. So you will see in blue our language functions. Where did those come from? So just a reminder, each one of our standards, and right now we're just focusing on the 3 communication standards, but we remind you that our culture standards are carried out using our communication standards. Each communication standard, each standard incorporates a set of language functions. So the first one, our interpretive standard, understand, interpret, and analyze. Interpersonal, our second standard, exchange information. So you can see exactly where we got these ideas over in this performance indicator. Exchange information, express feelings, express preferences, and express opinions. And finally, presentational communication are 5 language functions of describe, inform, narrate, explain, and persuade. So in other words, in every performance indicator, you should see the language of the standard in the performance indicator, starting with the language function. Context being the next of the 3 elements of performance in our performance indicators. Again, the circumstances or settings in which a person uses language shows up again in our performance indicator at left. Exchange information in conversations on familiar topics. So what are these topics? Well, our themes and topics. The themes and topics that were created by our New York State Standards Revision Committees, and that you have in 4 overarching themes with topics listed below, again, intended to be integrated, not that we have 17 units of instruction. And again, you'll find this in the folder. And the final of the 3 elements of performance is text type, the quantity and organization of language produced. This was one of those things that we spent a bit of time with in our last webinar. So again, if you haven't yet had the opportunity, we invite you to review the webinar on proficiency, remembering that each level of the inverted pyramid of proficiency, the reason that expands is because the volume of not only what students can do in terms of language functions and context, but also text types expand. And so our novices at that word and then phrase level, moving into our intermediates who are at the sentence level and strings of sentence level, and our advanced learners at the paragraph level. So in this performance indicator at left, we can see exchange information and conversations on familiar topics, creating simple sentences, and asking appropriate follow-up questions. So again, intermediate low, we are looking at the strings of sentences. So I turn it over to Bill.
Before I go into this next section, I wanted to pick up on an important question that was in the chat from Jennifer. What are the targets for ASL? And I forgot to mention that, and I apologize. It was the consensus of the working group of ASL teachers that they wanted to be included in the same standards as the category 1 and 2 languages. So their performance targets are the same as in category 1 and 2. So now that we're familiar with the contents of the performance indicators, let's see how we can take those elements and put them into unit and task-based learning targets that we shall call CanDo Statements. So what are CanDo Statements? CanDo Statements are what the learners should ultimately be able to do independently. So when we take all the scaffolds away, what should they be able to do? As Joanne showed us, for each standard and for each ACTFL sublevel, the performance indicators provide us with a basic description of what performance looks like at that proficiency level for that standard. The performance indicators include language functions, the context, and the text type. In creating unit-based learning targets, that's all we really need. The basic formula for a unit CanDo learning target is I can plus the language function plus the context. Unit CanDo statements always lead with a language function. They provide a communicative context. They are written in learner-friendly language, and this is a key that makes them useful, not just something to decorate a lesson plan, but something that we can really use to leverage in our instruction in helping our learners become more proficient. Write them in learner-friendly language. The unit CanDo statements are learner-facing. They're not task-specific, and they're not task-specific on purpose, because for each unit CanDo statement, you should be able to identify multiple ways that a learner could demonstrate that proficiency. They can accommodate a range of proficiency. So you could have someone approaching that level, at that level, or even beyond that level. So the way the unit CanDo statements are written, they can accommodate a range of performances that you'll see in a typical classroom. So meeting a unit CanDo statement can be shown in a multiplicity of ways. This can be done through formative tasks, summative tasks that can be performance-based or on-demand proficiency simulations. These tasks can be designed using task-based CanDo statements. Task-based CanDo statements show a specific acceptable evidence by which learning will be assessed. So the unit CanDo statements are more general, demonstrated in a variety of ways, used for self-assessment. They always identify the function in the context. I can plus function plus context. Whereas our task-based CanDo statements are more specific. They always identify the function in the context. We use the same stem as the unit CanDo statement. But then additionally, they'll also specify the skill, and they can show the cultural knowledge and the acceptable evidence. How is proficiency going to be shown? By what skill? So the entire equation for a task-based CanDo statement becomes I can plus function plus context plus skill plus cultural knowledge. Now let me talk a little bit about cultural knowledge. In each of these three communication standards, culture is always an implied component, even if not directly stated in the learning targets. For example, in Standard 1, cultural knowledge is obvious and evident if we're using authentic documents, authentic resources that become the basis for our interpretive communication. In interpersonal communication, the cultural knowledge lies in the roles of the interlocutors. The roles that the interlocutors are playing in that conversation, whether we're maybe having a conversation with a native speaker, or whether we're having someone playing the role of a native speaker in a simulated conversation. In presentational communication, the cultural knowledge can reside in the content of the presentation or in the audience to which the presentation is directed. So let's take a look at some illustrations of the difference between unit level and task level CanDo statements. So here are the performance indicators for standard 1. You see highlighted a red box. Let's take a look at a task for intermediate mid, which is level 3 or 4 students for category 1 and 2 languages and classical languages. It would be level 5 for category 3 and 4 languages. So we're going to consider this performance indicator. Understand the main idea and key information in short, straightforward, informational, and literary texts. Now, what will that look like in a unit CanDo statement and in a task-based CanDo statement? So again, we revisit our standards. We're going to always lead with our language functions that are embedded in the standard. So what are the language functions for interpretive communication? Understanding, interpret, analyze. Understand, interpret, analyze. And how do these manifest themselves? How do these evidence themselves? Well, understand can be sequencing events or identifying a main idea. Interpreting can include making predictions, inferring meaning. Analyze can be expressing personal reactions or identifying cultural perspectives. So we're going to take one of these functions to lead our unit CanDo statement with. So again, our CanDo statement, I can plus function plus context. So our unit CanDo statement might be, I can identify, that's our function for interpretive communication, for understanding, cultural perspectives of meal taking in Francophone countries. So meal taking in Francophone countries becomes a context for communication. So that's our student facing unit level CanDo statement for that unit. Now, how might we design tasks to evidence that CanDo statement? So Joanne has compiled a list of input-based assessment task designs. These are performance task formats that can be used in the different standards. This document for all of the standards is found in your folder. The ones identified for interpretive communication, if you just take a look at them, these are tasks that you are very familiar with. You've seen these before, you've used them time and time again in interpretive tasks. You know, multiple, just different kinds of questions, different kinds of binary choices, different kinds of completion activities, or manipulation of props or flashcards or pictures. These are ways that learners can output, can evidence their interpretation of texts. So how will these then be incorporated into our CanDo statements, into task-based CanDo statements? So we take our stem, same stem. I can identify the main idea and key details, and we add our context more specifically in a cooking video about traditional Quebecois cooking by completing a graphic organizer. So we have our basic stem from the unit CanDo statement, and we add our acceptable evidence, completing a graphic organizer, which shows what skill we're using. We're using a viewing skill, the cooking video, and we're completing a graphic organizer to show evidence our learning. I can identify the main idea and key details in an infographic about cheese production in France. So that's our authentic resource. That gives us our context, and we answer questions to show that we've comprehended this text. And again, our cultural knowledge is embedded right within the authentic documents that we're using. Now let's take a look at some illustrations for a different task statements for standard 2. So let's take a look at one of the performance indicators for intermediate low. Intermediate low would be for level 2 in category 1 and 2 languages, level 3 and 4 for category 3 and 4 languages. We're looking at the performance indicator that says exchange preferences, feelings, or opinions on familiar topics, creating simple sentences, and asking appropriate follow-up questions. So that's our interpersonal performance indicator. Let's see how this manifests itself. So we look at our language functions. For interpersonal, we have 4 language functions, 4 key language functions. And I look on these as kind of language big buckets in which we can put a bunch of other ways that this function can be manifested. For example, exchanging information can be manifested by making an appointment, asking for and giving directions, accepting or refusing invitations. And you see expressing feelings can be shown in several different ways. Expressing preferences, likes, dislike, make a request, ask or give advice, and then express opinions, agree or disagree, make comparisons, criticize. So these are all ways in which these functions can be evidenced. Again, okay. So you see that in the unit level, again, function and context, unit can-do statement, I can ask for and give advice. There's our language function about healthy living habits. So that's going to be our context. That's the theme about which we're communicating. How will it manifest itself in task-based can-do statements then? Well, we can engage students in a variety of tasks to show their interpersonal skills, a debate, a 4 corners activity, info gap activities, inside-outside circle, interview, survey, dialogue and journal entry, online simulated text messaging. These are ways we can show interpersonal communication among our learners. So these are the evidence we use in making our task-based can-do statements. Again, all activities that we're very familiar with, all tasks that we've led our students in many times in many contexts. So we take the stem of our unit can-do statement. I can give advice about healthy living habits. And then our acceptable evidence becomes in a conversation with an unhealthy friend. So the conversation is there, and that becomes the skill. I can ask for and give advice about healthy living habits. Again, the same stem in a role play conversation between a doctor and a patient. Now, there's not necessarily an evident cultural context here, evidence of cultural knowledge, but it can be easily inserted. You can define the roles of the doctor, perhaps, as someone from a target language country who would have maybe a different experience in terms of asking patient questions or something like that. Or you can base it on previous interpretive activities where you would have talked about healthy living habits from the viewpoints of the different target language cultures in using authentic resources. So that cultural knowledge can be easily inserted into the context of the tasks that we ask the students to do. So let's take a look at the performance indicators for Standard 3 presentational communication. And we've identified a novice high, which would be in roughly 8th grade for category 1 and 2 languages, grade 8 and level 2 for category 3 and 4 languages. Novice high is the presentational speaking target for checkpoints B and C, and the presentational writing target for checkpoint B in the classical languages. So let's take a look. It's present on familiar and everyday topics using simple sentences most of the time. So that's the performance indicator we're striving for. Again, we take a look. What are our big buckets, our 5 language functions? Describe, inform, narrate, explain, persuade. And then you see over at the right how these can be manifested, different ways that these language functions can be evidenced. We lead with one of those functions in our unit can-do statements. So our unit can-do statement for Standard 3 might be, I can describe, that's our function, describe, places to visit in a city or town. And that's our context for communication. So what ways can we evidence this performance of this proficiency goal, this proficiency target? All of these things that we've done in terms of in the past, student products by which they can evidence their learning, captioning, headlining, good sentence level activity, graphic organizers, fictional texts, producing fictional text, producing an informational text, producing a poem, demonstrations, performance, all of these presentational ways that students can evidence their presentational mode skills. So we take the stem of our unit CanDo statement. I can describe places to visit during a fantasy trip in an interactive poster presentation for younger students. So this is something that a task by which they could evidence achievement of the proficiency target. And I can describe places to visit in my own town in a 1-minute tourism publicity video. So that would be the means by which they describe the places to visit in their town. Again, the cultural context can be occur through the research done to do these different tasks, or from, again, previous interpretive tasks done throughout the unit. Also, we consider in presentational the audience that we're aiming towards. So if you're showing your town to native speakers from another country, you're going to have to consider those possible cultural misunderstandings that might take place, cultural differences and cultural similarities, in order to connect with your audience. Now, in the folder, we've included a works in progress list of key language function buckets for each communication standard, and some ways that these functions are used in real-world communication. This function list of verbs can help you write unit CanDo statements that lead with language functions. And again, you'll find that in the folder. Now, Joanne's going to help us put all of this together with some instructional implications.
Thank you, Bill. So, as he said, we're going to be putting these pieces together. Going back to our title about the performance indicators and CanDo statements. And so let's put this all together. This slide should look very familiar to you because it was from our last webinar on proficiency, but it applies equally or maybe even better to the discussion that we're having today in regard to performance. Instructors need to target instruction across 2 ranges: broadening learners' performance at their current range and working to develop some abilities at the next higher range. Remember, when we talk about proficiency, low means they're barely there, mid means they're solidly there, and high means they're most of the time reaching into that next level. And so we need to get them to that very, very solid place, and then we want to start pushing them to that next level. And this practice is referred to as comfort and stretch. And so let's take a look at these ideas and a few others. Comfort, when using our performance indicators. Oh, I wrote performance descriptor, but I'm referring to performance indicators. We're using one performance indicator, one performance descriptor for one communication standard. So you can see, for example, here I have an interpretive communication standard and one CanDo statement. So I'm really working on building that very solid level of performance at a given proficiency target. And how do I do that? With multiple performances. So think about the examples Bill gave you. He gave you one unit CanDo, and then he showed you 2 possible tasks, but there might be many others. And so that's what we're talking about with the comfort, giving our students many, many opportunities to solidly be at a given proficiency target through multiple performances. So that's comfort. Now let's look at stretch. So with stretch, we want to use 2 performance descriptors or 2 performance indicators with one communication standard and have 2 CanDo statements. So you'll see from standard 2 interpersonal communication, I have put the side-by-side descriptor for intermediate low, and intermediate mid, because what I have in my mind is that I want to build my students' capacity. And how do I do that? By using sequenced, scaffolded, elaborated performances. But I want you to notice that I'm conceptually presenting this with speaking bubbles because this is interpersonal communication, but I didn't have just one bubble for the intermediate mid and one for the intermediate low and one for intermediate mid. I had multiples because we don't get to that place without multiple opportunities. So we want to make sure we're using those strategies of elicitation, of expecting our students to elaborate by prompting them to do so, and spiraling our teaching and the language function, the text types, the contexts. We also can use our performance indicators as a tool for differentiation. We may be using 2 or more performance descriptors or performance indicators with a given communication standard and 2 or more can-do statements. So you see, for example, I have interpersonal communication here, and I'm showing the intermediate low and the intermediate mid and the intermediate high. And it may be that my course is associated with intermediate mid, maybe a 10th grade course in a category 1-2 language. However, I have students who are heritage learners who are much more proficient. And so I want to be directing my instruction for them at the intermediate high level. However, I may have students who, for any range of reasons, may not be where the course target is. And I want to make sure that I'm solidly building them where they are so that I can then bring them to where they need to go next. Not from any kind of deficit perspective, but rather from an acknowledgement of the range of learners who are in front of me and using my tools to support them. And then I also think about sequencing. In this case, I've got 2 performance descriptors or performance indicators with 2 different communication standards and 2 can-do statements. And of course, this could be multiplied if I'm doing this for learners at different levels of proficiency. Whereby, for example, I may have intermediate mid in the interpretive standard and the interpersonal standard, because what I'm attempting to do is create sequenced performances that reflect natural communication. Because isn't that really the target, the goal of our field, to develop bilingualism and biliteracy, where our students can use language for real world purposes? Well, in the real world, we don't just speak on a given day or just read on another given day. We might read something and then from there go have a conversation with others about what we have read. We might have read something or viewed something and want to write something about it. And so the integration of the modes, as Laura Terrell presented to us in our 4th webinar back in May, really is a core element of the work that we do. And so our performance indicators are a tool that support us in really designing our instruction to reflect that real world natural communication. So to conclude, I would like to talk just a little bit about some of the real advantages and benefits of can-do statements. We've alluded to them, but I just want to make them explicit here. First, they provide clarity. As Ellie Moeller wrote, students are most apt to learn at high levels when teachers clarify learning intentions for their students and themselves. I know when Bill and I do these webinars, we start with our can-do statements, and then we check ourselves over and over and over again on the content of these webinars. And sometimes the can-do statements get modified. It's not like they're set in stone until you've gotten to that place where you have clarity. And when you have clarity, using that learner-friendly language, you can make sure your students have that same clarity and a shared understanding. And I just want to make one other point about this statement. This wasn't just Allie Moeller making a statement. She did a longitudinal study that showed it was with a school, actually it was, I think, 5 schools that used can-do statements and other schools that did not, and the performance levels of the schools, and they were a range of socioeconomic contexts and similar variables and a range of variables. The students where there were can-do statements, they absolutely had much higher performances and evidence of higher learning. So research-based. So the can-do statements communicate not only to the teacher and the students, but multiple audiences. We can make our work transparent to all the stakeholders, whether they be administrators, families, guardians, our colleagues. You know, sometimes our field can be mysterious to our colleagues. I know on my campus, they're like, oh, those modern language people, we don't really know what you do. And so we can make what we do transparent, and it isn't just, oh, that's the fun class. That's a learning class, and we're going to let people know what our students are learning. The can-do statements create opportunities for our students' self-assessment and goal setting. Again, from Allie Moeller's work. In self-assessment, students practice how to monitor, evaluate, and make plans for their own work in relation to a learning target. And in the center of this image, I've included a piece from Joshua Cabral that shows that continuum from what the students cannot do yet to what they can do with help, think Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, to being almost there, to being able to do something with confidence. And so this continuum of performance also embeds realistic goals. So if a student is not there yet, they know that the next step is to be able to do something with help. It's not to be able to do it with confidence. And if they can do it with help, the next step is to be able to do it better, moving towards that confidence, and then, of course, to be able to do with confidence. And so the final thing that I want to say is that can-do statements motivate. A focus on what students are able to do rather than what they cannot do gives students a sense of accomplishment. And isn't that what we want for all of our students? To feel accomplished, to know what their accomplishments are, and to not feel like, oh, I can't do this, because that's when we lose them. And that's when we don't have that motivating sense among our students that really is what creates a positive learning environment in our classrooms and beyond. So we're going to take a moment to revisit our learning goals from today. I can describe the relationship between performance and proficiency. I can identify the target proficiency ranges for each checkpoint. I can identify the contents and organization of the New York State World Language Performance Indicators. I can describe the relationship between standards, language functions, performance indicators, and learning targets. And I can write can-do statements driven by language functions and aligned to proficiency targets described in the performance indicators. So with that, we invite you to put your questions in the chat, and we know some of you already have, and our colleague Lori Langer de Ramirez has been monitoring that. So what questions do you have about the relationship between performance indicators, language functions, and can-do statements? And what are your major takeaways from this presentation on performance indicators, language functions, and CanDo statements. So again, we invite you to put those questions in the chat. And then Lori, we invite you to unmute yourself and share the questions with us and direct them to Bill or I, or answer them yourself.
Thank you so much, Joanne and Bill. That was super helpful. Lots of incredible information. Folks really appreciated the analogy of the puzzle cover. So there's a lot of really, I think folks thought that that was wonderful, even to communicate to students. And also an appreciation of Ali Moeller's work. Specifically, you're addressing the range of variables in her work. There were a few questions about the LOTE exam. I believe Candy addressed some of those. State Ed will be working with test developers, so that's kind of a future-looking question, I think. Let's see, we just had some new questions pop in. So one question from Selinda, what would be the best way to introduce the CanDo statements? Before and after the unit, in a document, in a personal journal? So really, how does that become operational?
Bill?
Yeah, I think all of the above. I mean, I think the power of CanDo statements for me is what Joanne talked about, that self-evaluation element. So to introduce the basic unit facing CanDo statements that first day when you're starting the unit, maybe right after you do the hook, you maybe shown them a little video to hook them into the theme, and then do some work with that, and then show them where they're going in the unit, what the CanDo statements are, and then revisit them maybe halfway through the unit. Take a look at them. You're revisiting them every day when you tell them your learning target for the day, because those stems are there every day. You're just adding the way that they're going to, the task that they're going to be engaged in that day to show that. So you're constantly recycling those same stems from those unit CanDo statements. Take a look at them in the middle of the unit. Have them use that not yet, with help, almost, can do scale, that little force scale that Joanne was talking about from Joshua Cabral, and use that as a basis of their self-assessment, and then maybe planning what they could do between now and the end of the unit to become more confident in these. And then again, use them with your summative assessments at the end of the unit, revisit them again, so that you're constantly putting them in front of the students, so they know what the roadmap is. They know what you're using. And for me, that's the number one power of these things. That's what's worth the time. That's what's worth the focus on the language function. So that's always there for the students, always know what they're doing and why they're doing it.
That's great, Bill. Thank you. And if I can add one question that popped up, which I thought was really good regarding the CanDo statements, what to do with those kids who think they can, but really can't. And conversely, those who think they can't, but can. So I can start by addressing that, you want to be working with students so that they really understand what it means to be able to do the tasks in those CanDo statements. So little by little, they'll start to kind of get a really clear sense for what they're able to do and can't do. And that is, as Bill said, the beauty of the CanDo statements. You're really engaging them in understanding this whole proficiency pathway and their role in it and the direction that they're heading. Bill and Joanne, can you add anything to that?
I just want to add, this is about consistency of performance. It's about what they can do independently. So, when a student may do that, may perform to a particular target on a given task, but it's about what they can do across multiple tasks and what they can do independently. So that's one thing. Part of this is educating your students. The other thing is the performance indicators themselves, they're written in that very student-friendly sort of language. And so, they don't have to be the teacher's secret. They can be shared, or they can be, made visible to students in some way.
The feedback we give on student work is also the critical element in terms of helping students understand where they are in relationship to that target. And you give them, you got it. Now here's the next step. Here's how you can level up, or here's, you're almost there. Here's what you can do. Giving those specific, using that language of proficiency in very specific ways. You've given me a lot of great sentence fragments. Let's see if we can string them into complete sentences. Or we have some really good sentences here. Are there ways we can join them together and approximate a paragraph level discourse, that type of thing. Giving students feedback to help them know exactly what they need to do to show those. And that's why for us to have a clear understanding of what the characteristics are of each proficiency sublevel is so critical, so that we can give that performance so students know exactly where they are in relationship to hitting that target.
Yeah, I'll add by saying this really demystifies the entire process. You know, so often we have students who are compliant. They kind of sense what the teacher wants. That's really all they want to know. What is it the teacher wants? And that's what I'm going to give back on my work. But this really puts the students in the driver's seat, demystifies. It's not what I want. It's what you are working on to move forward in that proficiency growth. So it's incredibly powerful for students. So lots of talk in the chat about CanDo statements. I recommend to everyone just have a look at all the different recommendations and suggestions about how to incorporate CanDo statements into your daily teaching. And lots of kind of good conversation around differentiation as well. Let's see. Oh my goodness, so many questions and comments. Let's see.
Oh, I want to address this one thing about the verbs, the language of the verbs. When you use, and this is some training that we kind of have to do with administrators, and that we're working on to try and communicate to administrators, that your CanDo statements are going to be written in terms of language functions first, and not you know, some fluffy list of Bloom's verbs. We're going to be focusing on language functions. And so that's part of what we are going to be about, trying to communicate to administrators and supervisors that that's how we're measuring student progress in terms of these CanDo statements written from the point of view of language functions. It's a different, it's a kind of an important difference that makes our field different, because we're not teaching content, we're teaching proficiency, we're teaching language proficiency skills. It's a whole different yardstick we're using to measure progress. And that's something that we're working hard to try and communicate to your administrators.
Thank you, Bill. Leah asks, would we say that the main shift in our pedagogy is less emphasis on learners' grammatical accuracy? In other words, conjugating verbs correctly.
So that has actually been the shift since 1986, as articulated in Modern Languages for Communication. As we go up the proficiency level, the student's ability to be understood is dominating accuracy. And part of being able to be understood is to use more and more precise vocabulary and to use more and more correct grammatical forms and ones appropriate to the language function and the context. So it is about promoting language proficiency development relative to communication with support from grammar and vocabulary. And as we get into the beginning of 2022, that's where we will be focusing our webinars at that time.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, so again, going back to what Bill elaborated on, that question about higher order thinking skills. So really that tension when supervisors or administrators come into the classroom and are looking for higher order thinking skills, that tension between teaching language and the content. So there seems to be some confusion there on the part of our administrative colleagues as to what it is that they're looking for when they go to observe a lesson.
The first thing that always comes in my mind is the fact that we're having students do this work in a target language, which minimally puts us at the application level if we're talking Bloom's. So when we teach in the target language, when our students are functioning in the target language, everything we do is in higher order thinking. And, you know, and Bill mentioned we will be communicating with stakeholders, from administrators to parents to students. Again, the work of this initiative is robust and will be happening in time. So that will be part of the communication.
Thank you, Joanne. Lots of thanks, lots of appreciation, a lot of recommendations to go back and view past webinars, also to view this webinar again once it gets posted. There's lots of good information shared. So thank you both. This was fantastic.
So I know that we're past the hour and Candy will want to conclude the recording, but I'm willing to stay on for a little bit longer to I can't even talk, answer questions should people have them. And I'm sure Bill maybe as well.